The Horse Race is brought to you by Benchmark Strategies, Boston's leading public affairs and public relations consulting firm. To learn more, connect with Benchmark on LinkedIn at Benchmark Strategies or visit benchmark-strategies.com. Welcome back to The Horse Race, your weekly look at politics, policy, and elections in Massachusetts. I'm Steve Kazella, president of the Massing Polling Group. Today we're bringing you one of our favorite episodes from the Horse Race archives. In this episode, we were joined by Dr. Paul Watanabe of UMass-Boston to talk about a survey the Massing Polling Group conducted exploring the experiences and political views of Asian American and Pacific Islander residents of the Commonwealth. It's a wide-ranging conversation about representation, public opinion, and data. And as always, it's full of the horse race trademark witty banter you've either grown to love or loathe over the years. Originally aired as episode 352, here it is.
There's a new poll out in Massachusetts, and it is actually making waves both for what it found, but also for what it is. Here to talk about why and to get into all these details, we have Paul Watanabe, professor of political science and director of the Institute for Asian American Studies at the University of Massachusetts-Boston. Paul, welcome.
Thank you. Welcome to you too.
So I want to talk about the reasons behind the poll, its methodology, findings, and of course, finally, what this means for the state. But before we jump in, let's set the scene a little bit. Steve, this one's actually for you before we get to Paul. Tell us what this poll is in the most basic form.
Yes, so the poll we're talking about today is a poll of Asian and Pacific Islander Americans that we conducted across Massachusetts with 1,414 respondents. The poll is done in language, the poll is done with multiple modes, and the poll explored a lot of kinds of questions which will feel familiar to anybody who's followed our polling on other topics over the years.
So, Paul, there has been a lot of discussion over the years about what the importance is of having good data on underrepresented groups, what it means when that data is missing, what we'd like to use it for, how it can be helpful to the communities themselves. So this poll was a huge deal for a lot of reasons. So let's hear that a bit in your own words. What do you think is important for our listeners to know about why this survey was conducted in the first place?
Well, as Steve pointed out, it's a very common thing to have polls and surveys that test the things that are done in the study: electoral behavior, political behavior, positions on policy issues, etc. But the interesting thing about this particular poll is it included Asian Pacific Americans in it. You find a lot of polls that have been done by mainstream organizations that attempt to talk about things like political behavior and positions on policy issues, but Asian Americans are not included in those polls. They're listed as the other, for example, category. And there's little exploration about what the views are of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders on these basic issues. And this is the first statewide poll that does it in a comprehensive fashion. As Steve pointed out, it includes a large number of Asian American respondents who are drawn from the statewide sample. They include, which allows us to do what is critical to doing, to examining data on Asian Pacific Americans, that is to disaggregate some of that data. That average figures don't actually tell the story really about Asian Americans on a lot of various important variables. And then it allows, and we did it in terms of Chinese, Indians, and Vietnamese. We're able to pull out the data, disaggregate the data on them, and run that data with the large sample. Secondly, we did it in language, as Steve pointed out. We did it in 4 languages. We did it in English, Khmer, Chinese, and Vietnamese. And it was done in a way that allowed Asian Americans to finally become visible in this business, to have their views sort of reflected in opinions on things like political behavior questions or positions on policy issues. Something we haven't had an authoritative way for Massachusetts Asian Americans up until this point.
Just a quick note on that, too, and a reason that it's sort of remarkable is that oftentimes you'll see crosstabs in polls where we're looking at things by demographics, but, when you don't have enough to kind of break it out further, whoever's left goes into a category which is often titled other. And what this one basically does is it really zeroes in on that, not only to pull out Asian American and Pacific Islander American views as a whole, but then also to be able to split it out by groups like Chinese Americans, Indian Americans, Vietnamese Americans, and so forth. There's always more we can do, and we look forward to doing more in future waves. There's endless more ways to break it out, but even to get to this level of detail was a first.
So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about disaggregating the data, right? Saying that this group is often treated not just as a monolith, but also as kind of an afterthought. And so part of that framework is built into the name of the report itself, which is no longer invisible. So, Paul, can you tell me about kind of what we mean when we talk about what it means to be invisible as sort of a category of political entity here? What does it mean when we can't talk about, well, what are Chinese residents in Massachusetts thinking? What are their interests? How are those differing from Pacific Islanders? So who was invisible, and what does it mean to kind of make those populations visible?
The notion of Asian Americans being invisible in various ways, historically, socially, legally, and politically in the United States is very clear. That the notion of Asian Americans as being a part of the society in some respects, but being excluded from it. From the first days of the way that Asian Americans have been treated in terms of the way that they've been excluded from the country. They've been aliens without right to become citizens. They were the first group to be excluded when the Chinese in 1882. In 1924, essentially all Asian immigrants were excluded from the United States. And in beginning in 1941, with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, we had the first element in which a group, the Japanese Americans, were taken en masse and treated as though they were the enemy, even though whether citizens or non-citizens alike, and placed in incarceration camps by the United States. And this notion of Asian Americans being invisible, not being seen in some respects, despite their growing numbers. And this is true in particular in the last few decades. As I pointed out, for almost half a century, I've been doing political analysis and been asked simple questions like, what are Asian Americans' distribution in Massachusetts on their party identification, for example? It's hard to give that answer in some respects until now. They've remained invisible from these discussions. And they've remained invisible, I think, from the public eye in terms of discussions of various issues. And that invisibility has led to the belief that they in some ways can be dealt with as though they're not a community with human beings in it. In some ways, for example, I talk about how a continuing battle for Asian Americans in the Boston area has been a desire to try to protect Chinatown, this area of Boston that goes back to the mid-19th century, in which Asian Americans have constantly been in a battle to try to protect this area from institutional expansion, like roadways and like the combat zone, and like large institutional players like New England Medical Center and so forth. And yet they constantly put these demands on this particular community, not really recognizing, I think, fundamentally, that there are people who live there, that the people are invisible. The shops and the restaurants and so forth are very visible. But what is invisible is the fact that people live behind those shops and on top of those shops and restaurants and so forth. And in fact, Chinatown is one of the densest areas of population in the city of Boston in terms of the number of residents who live there. And the extent to which you don't recognize that people who live there, that they're visible. In some ways, it allows you to do things like put the combat zone there and think that it's not really impinging on people's lives and people who live there. And in some ways, that I think has been the story of Asian Americans traditionally throughout the history of the United States.
And this has also not just been kind of political behavior happening through a lack of knowledge, but also it's been entrenched in law in some of the ugliest periods of American history. Of course, you refer to the Japanese internment camps and the Supreme Court's Korematsu decision saying that we were allowed to treat the Japanese as essentially foreign combatants within our own borders has, I think, some very easy resonance to today when we're thinking about what it means to capture data on people and use it for certain means, or to kind of deliberately act as though not having good data or not good information on entire populations can also be an excuse to sort of dehumanize and push off to the side. So I think with that context, it would be helpful to look at the results themselves, because we're thinking about the ways that Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders are engaging with areas like housing, civic engagement itself, how they feel safe, if they have a sense of belonging, all sorts of things. So why don't we kind of kick off with the key issues that you were looking at and the top level findings? I think I'll have Steve do the top level results, and then Paul, we can really kind of dig into the content if that works.
Sure, and I'll just start with a question that we ask on a lot of polls, which is an open-ended question where we just ask people basically what they think the top issues are facing the state, or sometimes it's asked like, what do you think the state government should focus on, and so forth. And then people can say or write whatever they want, and we group those comments then into categories. So we asked that question, what the biggest issues are facing Massachusetts, and found the top set of issues are inflation, the economy, cost of living, those top three kind of grouped together. And then the second one, which is very familiar to anybody who has read polling on Massachusetts, is housing. So those were kind of the two top issues, which we also then heard, some very powerful stories at the event that we had this week, where we released the survey about the ways that housing kind of impacts everyday life. So that was the big first topic, was just like, what issues are of concern to you? And those were kind of the top few.
And so, Paul, what was striking you about the results on housing? That there is this sort of commonality between Asian residents in Massachusetts and a lot of residents in Massachusetts about being very concerned with how expensive it is to live here.
Yeah, it seems to me that the thing that's not surprising is the fact that there is a commonality between Asian Americans and other people in Massachusetts who talk about these bread and butter issues, like the economy and expensive healthcare and affordability of housing and so forth. These are a traditional part of the landscape of problems that face all people in Massachusetts, and they face Asian Americans as well. And the reason why it may seem a bit surprising is there's another sort of belief that Asian Americans have been racialized as though they're the model minority, as though they all are at the top of their class in terms of educational attainment. They all drive fancy cars. They don't have any economic concerns or so forth, that they're economically all successful across the board, et cetera. And that element is sort of blown out of the water a little bit when you look at our data and find out that across age and economic conditions, you find, for example, that there are these demands in terms of the affordability of housing and healthcare and other areas that are critical to people's lives. And to find out that Asian Americans, like others, struggle with these issues. In some respects, there's a consensus in Massachusetts around the importance of these issues, and Asian Americans recognize it, and they're dealing with it on a constant basis.
And so I'd like to jump a little bit around. One of the other top lines was something that feels connected to me, which is this sense of belonging and experience with discrimination here. So Steve, walk us through the top lines on that one.
Yes. So we asked the fairly basic question, how much do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Quote, I feel like I belong in the United States. And we found that most people agree at some level that they do feel like they belong in the United States, but only 39% said that they strongly agree. So that leaves a lot of people who say that they either just somewhat agree or that they actually disagree. We asked some follow-up questions about things like experiences with discrimination and so forth, and found that, lots of people had faced discrimination in public places, on social media and so forth, and that those feelings are actually related to that feeling of belonging. So if you disagree, basically saying, I don't necessarily feel like I belong in the United States, you were about twice as likely to also report that you had faced discrimination.
And so how did that strike you, Paul? We talked a little bit about the ways that being an invisible entity to a lot of policy spaces can result in terrible policy around Asian populations, but seeing this result, that people are feeling it themselves and that it is connected to them trying to kind of access the sense of belonging in place. Did that square with what you've been hearing?
Well, this is a particularly disturbing finding that we have about the sense of belonging. I think the sense of belonging, that the measure of it has to be the one that says that the people really strongly agree that they belong. If anybody believes less than they strongly agree here in the United States that they belong, then it's problematic about how their reception here in the United States and how they feel that they're being received in the United States. And the fact that so many Asian Americans indicate that they don't strongly believe that they're part of the United States or accepted in the United States is problematic in large sense. And it's a large sense because one of the impetuses for this survey was the fact that in the COVID-19 period, we saw a significant rise again of the anti-Asian violence, which is a product of that sort of sense of Asian Americans and others being foreign in some respects, about being perpetual foreigners, that trope that we talked about at the beginning of this discussion about how it carried through the treatment of Asian Americans and Japanese Americans and other people in the United States. How that conception about Asian Americans being perpetually foreign, that is tied to their countries or their ancestors rather than to the United States, reflected itself in the COVID-19 period, where we saw a rise of anti-Asian violence against anti-Asians. And we wanted to see if this element continued. And it seemed to have reflected itself as well in our data that said, for example, that of those who did indicate that they felt less than accepted, almost 25% or 23% suggested in the last year that they had suffered some sort of racial discrimination in the United States. 21% said that they received a racial slur, that some 14% or something had received some verbal harassment, some 10% had indicated either the threat or actual physical violence against them. These are figures that are disturbing, I think, to any degree. The fact that this level of violence is one that is concerned, that's focused on this population, there's concern about it, the threat of it also raises anxiety and concerns, is something that I think is a concern that is raised specifically in terms of Asian Americans in the United States right now.
I think we should also note, of course, that this feeling of not being welcome, having kind of conditions on your presence here has been made much worse in recent months because of, for instance, the federal government's approach and tenor toward foreign students, for instance, quite aside from deportation proceedings, which have been catching a lot of groups up in it. But when you're thinking about Massachusetts, a lot of the students who are enrolled in the university system here, and especially the foreign students, a lot of them are coming from Asia. And so this idea that those sorts of rights and accesses can kind of be yanked back, I think knits together in an unfortunately timely manner. And I think that takes us to the last of these chunks here, which is what we learned about civic engagement and political affiliation. So again, Steve, why don't you start us off at the top, and then we'll let the doctor take us out with the analysis.
Yes. Okay. So we asked a few questions on politics. We asked both the questions about whether you're registered to vote and so forth, and whether you did vote in 2024, and if so, for whom, and found there that Asian and Pacific Islander Americans in Massachusetts favored Harris far more than Trump. We found 50 of those who did answer, it wasn't everybody, but 59% said that they voted for Harris, 23% for Trump. And when you look at party ID, basically which party do you feel closer to, we also found a very strong preference for Democrats, but not uniform and not universal. And there was some interesting kind of variation there too. And this was one of the things that a survey of this magnitude lets us break out. And I think there will be a lot more written about this, a lot more said about it as time goes on. But just to kind of give you a sense, we found that Indian residents, 64% of them identified as Democrats. Among Chinese Americans, it was 55%. Among Vietnamese Americans, it was 45%. So there's actually a pretty big variation in terms of party affiliation, that this kind of survey is unique in letting us kind of ferret out.
And I think that's a wonderful way to kind of hand this over to you, Paul, which is, we were talking about disaggregation. We were talking about the reasons why we might want to break apart these racial groups and these ethnic groups a little bit more than is usually done. So when you're looking at this civic participation and party affiliation data here, you said up top that was something that was unusual and new and a bit surprising. So tell us why.
Well, on the data on registration and turnout tends to be, when you ask a question after the fact, whether somebody was registered to vote or whether they participated in an election, Survey research tells us that many people tend to enhance their reality. That is, the figures for turnout and registration are higher than you expect it to be. So our figures are a bit higher than we expect them to be for Asian Americans as well. But given that factor, they still remain quite high for those who participated in the election and those who went over the hurdles of becoming a citizen and then having to register to vote and actually turning out. That on all those measures, Asian Americans performed quite well. And they also performed well on other measures of political participation, not including voting, as we might expect. For example, a community that is largely made up of immigrants is one that often needs to have to pursue means other than voting in order to have an impact. And Asian Americans, relative to other Americans, tend to participate in these activities at a slightly heightened level, we found, than is the norm for much of the population. Things like writing a petition, contacting their congressman or a government official about an issue or something, or contributing funds to a campaign or something like that. In some respects, that sort of activity goes beyond voting, and in that regard, Asian Americans did tend to participate in those levels at fairly high levels in those activities. And Asian Americans are continually recognized, I think, as a group that is capable of participating effectively in the political process, and will do even more so. They're 5% of the population. They're 5 to 7% of the population, depending on how you measure it. They're the fastest growing racial group in the United States right now and in Massachusetts. And they will soon become the largest immigrant group in Massachusetts. So they're growing like crazy. They're an immigrant group largely, and that helps define their sense of being perceived as an outsider as well. But in some ways, their potential is terrific. And this survey, I think, indicates the level, the possibility there is amongst the Asian American population to serve not only their communities, but the larger interests of the Massachusetts electorate in the electoral arena and in other ways. And it's incumbent upon us to pay some attention to them now that we have these vehicles by which we can find out and answer those simple questions like, what are the policy preferences of Asian Americans? What did they do? They think about the policies coming out of Washington now in terms of the shock and awe policies. What do they see as the prospects for the United States under some of these policy issue areas? These are areas that Asian Americans have been invisible and not a part of. And now in Massachusetts, at least, we have the capacity to do this. And I hope we can continue to do it in the future.
All right. Well, that is all the time we have for this segment. Thank you again, Paul Watanabe, for breaking this all down for us. I'm glad that we have a lot more data to go through than we did just last week.
Thank you very much.
I'm Zainab Asma-Doyle, Research Director at the Massing Polling Group. The Massing Polling Group serves the region's leading foundations, political groups, government entities, and businesses. Our surveys and focus groups bring high-quality data to the toughest questions facing society today. Learn more at massingpolling.com.
That is all the time we have for today. I'm Steve Kazella, signing off with Jennifer Smith. Our producer is Charlie Kazella. You can write to us at thehorseracepodcast@gmail.com with pictures of your braided curlers made in a steel World War I era military helmet. For now, don't forget to give The Horse Race a review wherever you're hearing us now. Subscribe to Commonwealth Beacon's daily download and reach out to us here at the Massing Polling Group if you need polls or focus groups done. Thank you all for listening, and we will see you next week.